Hello and welcome to the Global Dialogue. I'm Shireen Bhan. The government has set an ambitious target of installing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030, in keeping with its commitment to source about half of its energy needs from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. Philanthropic organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation have reinforced its support to India's energy transition. The foundation announced a $75 million commitment to support rural electrification in India in 2015 and then topped it up with a partnership with Tata Power to develop rural microgrids. Rockefeller's President Rajiv Shah is currently in India along with leaders from the foundation. He joins us now to talk about where things currently stand and their assessment on what the road ahead looks like and the role that India can play through its G20 presidency on crucial issues like climate and the Sustainable Development Goals. Rajiv, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. It's good to have you here in India. This is the first visit post the pandemic that brings you here to India. So I wanted to understand from you, what's the sense that you get on how much progress has been made on each of these issues I just talked about on the ground?
Well, Shireen, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It is my first visit since COVID-19 took place and started nearly 3 years ago. And I have to say, although there has been tremendous progress in India, perhaps more so than any other large emerging economy, at introducing renewable energy technology as a more serious component of the energy mix here, the reality is there's still a long way to go to help make sure that those energy technologies are not just a larger share of the overall energy mix, but actually deliver a development dividend so that users of renewable energy are able to start businesses, are able to create jobs, are able to send their children to school, are able to turn on the lights at night and keep them on in a reliable manner, and are able to really have the renewable energy revolution be something that creates tremendous human uplift in the living conditions of hundreds of millions of people.
You know, you're right in pointing out that there is a long distance to cover, and there are, of course, very ambitious targets that the government has set. But I want to understand from you, in your conversations with private sector participants, in conversations with the people that you're already working with, companies like Tata Power, etc., give me an update on where things stand in your partnerships here in India on issues like rural electrification and further partnerships that you intend to ink here.
Well, you know, the Prime Minister has established really robust and very ambitious goals for renewable energy in India. And it's so important that India achieves these goals, both because achieving these goals will allow hundreds of millions of people to lift themselves up the economic ladder, and because Indian ingenuity, innovation, and private sector partners really are the key to making sure that these energy technologies are available in Africa and parts of Latin America and elsewhere around the developing and emerging world. Our assessment is that in many cases our public-private partnerships, which is how the Rockefeller Foundation works, are succeeding. I met with the Tata Power team, for example, that talked about the 200 mini-grids they've developed and the tens of thousands of customers they already serve, and how they create jobs because they're able to do that. The challenge is getting the cost down, and the challenge is allowing for greater scale to reach, you know, not just a few hundred additional mini-grids, but to create the thousands and thousands of additional distributed renewable electrification sites that we think need to be part of the energy mix going forward. In addition to that, we have explored a number of partnerships around battery and energy storage to allow the grid system itself to take on more intermittent energy capacity, and frankly with agricultural and other partners to make sure that customers, especially in the rural areas, use power in a way that helps them earn more, helps their farms be more productive, and allows them to, you know, have more income so they move up the economic ladder. That's ultimately our goal.
Yeah, so two questions, Rajiv, just to follow up on what you told us just now. On the battery and storage side, Are these partnerships that you are on the anvil of inking, or have these partnerships already been done? And two, you talked about scale, 200 mini grids that you spoke of, or microgrids that you spoke of. You're absolutely right in pointing out that there needs to be, a far greater scale. What's the big constraint there? Is capital the constraint, or what's holding it back? And how do you see that progressing? Both those questions, Rajiv.
Well, both for energy storage and for scaling distributed renewable solutions, we see the same constraints. Number one, the cost of capital remains too high. Financing is expensive relative to other parts of the world. The debt crises that are existing in dozens of countries around the world, and the pressure on interest rates that you've been describing today that has led to some of these bank issues in other communities, has also raised the price of capital for developers in India and elsewhere around the developing world. So the cost of capital is too high, and Rockefeller and our partners are trying to defray or de-risk these investments for our partners so that we can bring that cost of capital down. Second, access to the actual technology itself is way too expensive. Solar panels are 30% more expensive for small-scale rural developers than they are in other parts of the world. Batteries are often not even accessible at all, and when they are, they're 300 or 350% more costly than they would be in other parts of the world. We need to solve that. India should have very robust local supply chains and resilient supply chains for these critical energy security commodities. And so the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which Rockefeller is a part of, is helping to make that real. The final big constraint is government capacity. The government has set extraordinarily important targets, but as we see elsewhere in the world, working with state governments and others, it often requires partnerships, public and private, in order for the state to have the capacity to help govern the energy capacity and the energy system in a manner that ushers in renewables at a far higher rate. And we work on that issue as well.
Yes, government bandwidth and capability, in dealing with some of these issues, especially at the local level, is going to be critical. But, should we expect a further top-up to that $75 million commitment that Rockefeller has already made? It's been a while. 2015 is when you announced that. Is a top-up expected?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we've already achieved that top-up, to use your phrase. The Rockefeller Foundation, together with others, the Bezos Foundation and the IKEA Foundation, have committed $1.5 billion to help expand access to renewable energy technologies in developing and emerging economies around the planet. And the single biggest program we have in any country is in India. And it's appropriate because India can create tens of millions of green jobs by deploying renewables in a particular manner. India can avert significant carbon emissions by doing the same relative to the baseline. And most importantly, India can help small businesses and entrepreneurs across this country have reliable, always-on, affordable electricity that would help them create jobs, create growth, and create inclusiveness in the Indian economy, which has been a major objective of the Prime Minister. And so we're very focused on that, and we're deploying a significant amount of that $1.5 billion grant fund, plus the investment commitments, another $10 billion that have come along with it in India.
Rajiv, let's talk about the role that India can play on some of these crucial issues, like the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the reform that's expected for international finance institutions. You wrote an op-ed just before your visit here to India, where you talk about how significant a role India can play, given its G20 presidency. On the reform that is expected as far as finance institutions like the World Bank, etc., are concerned, we don't know whether it's going to be Ajay Banga. He is, of course, the nominee that the U.S. has proposed, and we're hoping to get clarity on that soon. But what's your expectation? What would you prioritize in terms of the changes that are needed for these organizations to be more relevant to today's times?
Well, look, these organizations were created in the aftermath of World War II, at a time when the focus was reconstructing Western Europe. They are not designed to fund and finance and support nations in addressing major global public goods, such as fighting a pandemic or developing the kinds of energy storage solutions and making them broadly accessible so that countries can efficiently bring more renewables onto their grid architecture and avert significant climate consequences over time. To meet these mandates, these institutions will need to do a few things differently. The first is significantly extend their time horizon for thinking, planning, and offering their debt sustainability analysis. India has a plan by 2047 to become a wealthy nation, and for that to be through and through every sector of the economy in every state in the country. That's the kind of long-term planning and investment that's required, and these institutions often focus on the short term, 5 years at a time. Second, there needs to be much more liquidity in the system. These institutions have essentially not changed the way they manage and leverage their balance sheets over the last 50 years, since about the early 1970s. Now is a time when there's real political consensus to be much more aggressive in leveraging these balance sheets and do it in a public-private manner that can generate hundreds of millions of billions of dollars of additional liquidity. And it's essential that that happen through the G20 and other leadership vehicles. And finally, and most importantly, these institutions were set up at a time when all anybody thought about was public finance and public-to-public relationships. The reality is the dynamism of the Indian economy is in the private sector. The dynamism of the global financial system is in the private sector. And so we need to create new instruments that help attract private investment and use these big, older public institutions to de-risk those private investments. The best single example of that I can point to right now in the energy technology space is, in fact, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which Rockefeller and other partners have helped create on a global basis. And we need many more of those types of innovations in order to make the whole system genuinely scalable to address the challenges we face together.
You know, you talked about private sector dynamism and the public sector stepping in to de-risk, and that's essentially what we are seeing happen at this point in time. Not so much dynamism on the private sector part in the context of what we are seeing with the financial sector meltdown, albeit not a contagion just yet, and of course the public sector stepping in to prevent a contagion. What do you make of what we're seeing happen, once again revisiting to some extent the kinds of issues that we saw play out through the 2008 financial crisis and the implications of this on some of the development agenda goals?
Well, the implications of this global economic situation on the development agenda is actually quite disturbing. The reality is, over 20-plus years, we had a lot of convergence in human development. Countries that were lower income grew much faster than countries that were higher income. That growth helped lift people out of poverty and lift up their living conditions and their standards, and we saw real convergence and achievement of progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. COVID has devastated that, and during COVID, wealthy countries spent 30% of their GDP shoring up their economies. Emerging economies spent 6%, and less developed countries spent only 2%. And as a result of that, we're seeing real divergence now in terms of human development outcomes. More people are energy poor versus less. More people are hungry because of a global food crisis, in part caused by the crisis and conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Fewer people have access to the health care they need in order to achieve the maternal and child health goals, which India has so strongly committed to and has led international efforts on. So in order to turn that around, we really do need to understand that to meet the moment we're in, from a moral basis, from a global security basis, and from the basis of creating inclusive economic growth everywhere, we need to do things very, very differently. And that's why the Rockefeller Foundation has advanced a strong agenda for the G20 and is partnering with the G20. And frankly, it's why I'm hopeful that Prime Minister Modi, with his strength as a political leader and with India's example as a rapidly growing country embracing renewable electrification at the scale it is, can actually use this G20 to change the course of development and climate history.
Rajiv, you are hopeful that there could be a change in course, but what is the best outcome that you would hope for from, of course, the meeting here in India in September when the G20 leaders meet, but also in Paris, where India is, of course, also going to be hosting the meeting as far as international finance institutions are concerned? What is the best outcome that you hope for?
Well, all of these processes will help build the political consensus around transforming the global financial system as it relates to climate and development finance. And I hope for a few big outcomes. First, I want everyone to see that the only way to protect the planet from catastrophic climate change is to invest in resilient infrastructure that helps people live better lives in developing and emerging economies. That's an observation that India understands, and India is a great example of. That's not a concept that every G7 nation fully appreciates. Too many people think of climate and development as different things, and too many people don't see just how much large-scale, long-term investment is required to solve both challenges together. Second, I think the G20 can actually implement some of the reforms we've been talking about. For example, India's already set the goal of bringing 25 gigawatts of solar power into its agriculture sector and focusing on improving farmers' incomes and livelihoods in doing so. We could partner with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, public and private, to put in place model programs that are exactly what should be happening on a larger global scale, where you use private money from places like the Rockefeller Foundation to de-risk commercial investment in these types of efforts and greatly expand performance against those targets and objectives. And I think it's very important that the G20 not just be a place where there's a lot of talk, but also a place where there's a lot of action. And the Rockefeller Foundation has been able to support action in India for more than 100 years, and we hope to continue that trend.
Well, that certainly is the hope that we will see more action. But, speaking about some of the risks, and we spoke about this when we met earlier this year in Davos, since then we've, of course, seen energy prices coming off even more sharply, specifically in the last fortnight. There continues to be uncertainty on the Russia-Ukraine war. President Xi meeting with President Putin. We don't know whether this is going to lead to any kind of a breakthrough yet. But how would you assess risks at this point in time, especially in the context of the war and its impact on both energy as well as food security?
Well, I think both the war and a number of other global trends are resulting in the reality that interest rates across the board, fuel prices across the board, and food prices across the board will remain elevated for a significant period of time looking forward than they have been when you look over a longer period of time backwards at what the average prices have been. There'll be fluctuations, of course, that are very short term, but in general, we should be planning for a higher food price situation, a higher fuel price situation, and higher interest rate situation looking to the future. And what that means is not just sort of a small discomfort in the living standards of people who live in wealthier nations. It means we have to fundamentally rethink how we make capital available, public and private, in developing and emerging economies so that we can make the kinds of investments that GAP and other partners here in India are making to ensure that the future actually yields more opportunity for people who've previously been left behind.
Rajiv, before I let you go, you're here in India assessing the impact of the work that's already been done by the Rockefeller Foundation in partnership with Indian companies like Tata Power, etc. If I were to ask you to map out for me the next big milestones that you hope to achieve here, what would those be?
Well, I'll just give you three to make it easy. The first is in energy. I think we're going to continue to expand partnerships, not just on rural mini-grids, but on grid-based storage and battery storage for the grid to demonstrate that the grid can take on more renewables. on productive use examples like solarizing agriculture and agricultural value chains across the country to improve food, nutrition, and income outcomes for farmers and rural communities, and so many other examples. So unlocking entrepreneurship through renewable electrification will be a big focus going forward. Second, we've continued to invest in health and food as we have for decades. Most recently, during COVID, we worked a lot on the rapid testing. We worked on making vaccines accessible in communities across the country. We continue that effort because India has such an opportunity to be one of the first countries to, at scale, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in child and maternal mortality. So we're very focused on that. And third, we continue to work together on thinking about climate adaptation, climate modeling. A large part of my trip is visiting with communities that will be made more vulnerable from climate changes, whether they're farmers who will struggle to grow their crops or salt pan workers who otherwise suffer when there's extreme heat. And understanding that climate changes will affect the most vulnerable people and putting in place the science and the partnerships to help preclude and prevent that deleterious change will be another priority for us as we look to the future.
You know, Rajiv, on the climate adaptation side, you spoke specifically about agriculture as well and food. Are you looking at the startup ecosystem in India? Because there are a lot of companies that are working on providing innovative solutions within the agri-tech space. You know, is that an area of interest and opportunity for you?
Well, it absolutely is. And in fact, we've already invested in agricultural technology and alternative proteins, in different kinds of production systems, in heat-tolerant, heat-sensitive crop development. Indian agricultural scientists, working often at institutes that Rockefeller's been involved with for decades, continue to work on those important priorities. In addition to that, we've been very focused on helping to develop more regenerative agricultural systems. The reality is, the future of agriculture needs to include more regenerative production. That means production that helps make soils richer as opposed to depleting those soils. It means production that better uses the natural resources, especially water, that is available. And it means production that's often more focused on high-value crops that can help improve the nutrition outcomes of local populations, as we're doing with certain partners, you know, in and around Delhi, where we are right now. So that remains a priority for us.
Well, Rajiv, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's always good talking to you. Thanks very much for joining us here on the Global Dialogue to take us through what you've got planned here on this trip in India specifically, but more importantly, the milestones that you hope to mark in your journey here. Always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us. We will take a break here on the Global Dialogue, but the news continues here on CNBC-TV18. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a minute with a lot more.